Sometimes the smallest act of disrespect reveals the biggest mistake a person will ever make. The afternoon sun hung low over a quiet street in Birmingham, Alabama. The kind of warm southern afternoon where the air feels thick and slow and people move at their own steady pace. And on the corner outside a small brick bank branch, 72-year-old Evelyn Carter stepped carefully down the concrete steps with a worn brown purse held close against her coat. Inside it, an envelope containing a little over $900 in cash, money she had withdrawn after weeks of saving. Every bill folded neatly because to her every dollar carried a purpose: groceries, medication, and a few small things that make living alone a little easier. Evelyn moved slowly but with dignity, the same quiet dignity she had carried through decades of hard work and long days raising her only son after her husband passed away years ago. She had just reached the sidewalk when the sound of a police cruiser rolling up beside the curb cut through the quiet afternoon. The car door opened, and Officer Derek Collins stepped out, tall, confident, the badge on his chest catching the sunlight as he looked Evelyn up and down with a suspicious stare that made nearby pedestrians slow their steps. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone sharp and certain as if he had already made up his mind about something no one else could see. His partner, Officer Mark Reynolds, leaned casually against the cruiser watching the scene unfold while a few people across the street glanced over, unsure whether to keep walking or stay. Evelyn blinked, confused but calm, tightening her grip on her purse. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked softly. Collins gestured toward the envelope she had just placed inside her bag. "That's a lot of cash to be carrying around," he said. "Where'd it come from?" The question hung in the humid air. Evelyn explained it was her savings, money she had just withdrawn from the bank, but Collins reached out anyway and asked her to hand over the envelope for what he called verification. Cars passed slowly. Someone across the street quietly lifted a phone. Collins flipped through the stack of bills with a skeptical expression, exchanging a look with Reynolds before sliding the envelope into his own. Hand like it belonged there. Evelyn's voice trembled slightly as she said that money was important to her, that she needed it for medication and bills, but Collins simply told her it would be held temporarily while they looked into things. To everyone watching, it felt wrong, but the authority of the uniform kept the moment frozen in place. Evelyn stood there in silence as the cruiser doors closed and the officers drove away with the envelope still in Collins's possession. She remained on the sidewalk for a long moment, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement. And then she slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands shook a little as she scrolled to a familiar name and pressed call. When the line connected, she spoke only one sentence, quiet but heavy with something deeper than fear. "Danny, I think something happened today." Hundreds of miles away, a man who rarely rushed for anything slowly stood up from his chair because the two officers on that quiet Birmingham street had just made a decision that would soon bring far more attention than they ever expected. The small house where Evelyn Carter lived sat at the end of a quiet street lined with tall oak trees whose branches stretched over the road like an old protective roof. And as the sun lowered toward the horizon, the warm Alabama light slipped through the curtains of her living room while she slowly set her phone down on the wooden table beside a faded family photograph that had been there for years. The house was modest but carefully kept, the kind of home that carried the memory of every season that had passed through it. On one wall hung pictures of church gatherings, birthdays, and one particular photograph that always drew attention from visitors, a young man in his 20s standing beside his mother in a graduation suit, smiling with quiet confidence. That young man was Daniel Carter. Few people in the neighborhood had seen him in years. Evelyn had never spoken much about where he worked or why he traveled so often, only telling neighbors with gentle pride that her son protected people and that his work kept him busy far away from home. She had said it the same way every time, calm and simple, as if the details were not important. But tonight, the silence in the house felt different. Across town, the two officers who had driven away from the bank were sitting inside their patrol vehicle in the rear parking lot of the police station, the engine idling while the evening shift prepared to begin. Officer Derek Collins leaned back in his seat holding the envelope again, flipping through the bills slowly with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had complete control over the situation. Officer Mark Reynolds glanced over and shrugged. the moment already fading into what they both assumed was another routine stop that would never be questioned. The cruiser radio crackled softly with background chatter from dispatch, and the city continued moving around them, traffic lights changing, restaurants filling with dinner customers, families walking their dogs along sidewalks without realizing that something small but significant had just happened earlier that afternoon. A few blocks away, however, the person who had quietly recorded the scene outside the bank was replaying the video on his phone. The footage showed the moment Evelyn stood beside the cruiser, the confusion in her voice, the officers examining the envelope, and the uncomfortable feeling that something about the situation did not seem right. Within minutes, the clip was sent to a friend, then another, and slowly it began spreading through private messages and neighborhood group chats across Birmingham. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in a secure office building far from Alabama, Daniel Carter remained standing beside a wide window overlooking a darkening skyline. The phone was still in his hand from the call with his mother. He had not asked many questions. He did not need to. The quiet tone in her voice had told him everything he needed to know. Daniel Carter was known among the people who worked with him as a man who rarely reacted emotionally, someone who approached every situation with careful patience and precision. Yet the moment he heard the hesitation in his mother's voice, something changed in the room. A colleague sitting across the office noticed the shift immediately. Daniel reached for his coat, calm but focused, and as he walked toward the door, one of the staff members looked up and asked if everything was all right. Daniel paused for a brief second before answering in a steady voice that carried an unusual weight. He said that he needed to take a trip to Alabama. Tonight. What no one in Birmingham knew yet, including the two officers finishing their shift, was that the quiet man now preparing to travel was not simply a concerned son returning home. By the time the morning sun rose again over that quiet Alabama street, the small decision made outside the bank would begin to attract attention from places far beyond the city limits. The night air over Birmingham grew cooler as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the skyline, and inside the police station the routine rhythm of the evening shift had settled in like it did every night. Officers moved through the hallway carrying paperwork, the soft hum of fluorescent lights filling the quiet spaces between conversations. Officer Derek Collins sat at his desk, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the day had ended exactly the way he expected. Across from him, Officer Mark Reynolds tapped a report into the station computer, occasionally glancing toward the envelope that now rested in a desk drawer beside Collins. To them, it was already forgotten, another small incident that would disappear into paperwork if anyone ever asked about it at all. Collins eventually slid the drawer open again, pulling the envelope halfway out and counting the bills once more with a faint smirk before placing it back inside. Around them the station continued moving as usual, radios buzzing softly with dispatch calls and the front desk officer greeting a few late-night visitors who stepped through the glass doors. None of the officers inside realized that a short video recorded outside the bank earlier that afternoon had already traveled much farther than that quiet corner of the city. The man who filmed it had uploaded the clip to a local community page only an hour earlier, and by evening dozens of people across Birmingham had already watched it. The video showed the elderly woman standing beside the police cruiser, her voice calm but uncertain while the officers examined the envelope she had just withdrawn from the bank. There was nothing dramatic in the clip, no raised voices, no chaos, only a moment that felt deeply uncomfortable to anyone who watched it closely. In living rooms and coffee shops across the city, people replayed the moment where Evelyn Carter quietly explained that the money was hers, and many viewers began asking the same question. At the same time, meanwhile, inside her small house at the end of the oak-lined street, Evelyn Carter sat in the same armchair she had used for years, her hands resting gently on the edge of a worn quilt while the old wall clock ticked slowly above the fireplace. She had turned on a small lamp beside the couch, filling the room with warm yellow light that softened the quiet evening around her. The phone call with her son had been brief, but she knew him well enough to understand what his silence meant. Daniel had always been like that, even as a boy, calm and thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. He had promised her years ago that if she ever needed him he would come, no matter where he was. Tonight she believed him completely, Yet she did not fully realize how quickly that promise was already becoming reality. Several states away, an airport runway glowed under rows of bright white lights as a dark aircraft prepared for departure. Daniel Carter stepped onto the tarmac with steady calm, carrying only a small bag over his shoulder, while two people in formal suits spoke quietly with him beside the open door. One of them handed him a tablet displaying information that had already begun appearing online about the video spreading across Birmingham. Daniel looked at the screen only briefly before returning it. His expression remained controlled, but the quiet focus in his eyes told everyone nearby that the situation had already become personal. As the aircraft door closed behind him and the engine slowly began to rise in volume, the city of Birmingham continued through its ordinary night, unaware that by the time morning arrived, the simple encounter outside the bank would no longer be just another forgotten moment on a quiet street. Morning arrived slowly over Birmingham, Alabama, the pale orange light of sunrise stretching across rooftops and quiet streets while the city began waking up to another ordinary day. Yet in many homes and coffee shops, something unusual was already happening. Phones were lighting up with the same short video clip that had been quietly spreading throughout the night. The footage was simple and only a few seconds long, showing an elderly woman standing beside a police cruiser while two officers questioned her about an envelope of cash she had just withdrawn from the bank. The clip did not show the beginning or the end of the situation, but what people noticed was the tone of the moment, the confusion in the woman's voice, and the uneasy way the officers handled the money. By early morning, the video had already appeared on several local community pages and discussion boards across the city. Some viewers replayed the moment where Evelyn Carter calmly explained that the money belonged to her, while others focused on the expression on Officer Derek Collins's face as he examined the envelope. No one yet knew the full story, but the clip was beginning to attract attention from people who believed something about the situation deserved a closer look. At the police station, Collins and Reynolds walked through the front doors for the start of the next shift, unaware that the moment outside the bank had already reached thousands of screens across the city. Collins carried a cup of black coffee and greeted a few colleagues casually, while Reynolds checked the daily assignments posted near the dispatch desk. The atmosphere inside the station remained relaxed and routine, filled with the quiet conversations and small jokes that marked the beginning of every shift. To them, the previous afternoon was already fading into memory. A few miles away, Evelyn Carter sat at her small kitchen table, stirring a cup of tea while the morning news played softly on the television in the next room. She had slept very little during the night, not because she was afraid, but because she had been thinking about the phone call with her son. She trusted Daniel more than anyone else in the world. He had always been steady and thoughtful, the kind of man who believed in solving problems the right way no matter how complicated they seemed. What she did not realize was how quickly the situation had already begun moving beyond the quiet boundaries of her neighborhood. Far above the clouds, the aircraft carrying Daniel Carter continued its steady flight toward Alabama. The cabin remained silent except for the low hum of the engines, while Daniel studied information displayed on a tablet in front of him. The same short video that had begun circulating online was now paused on the screen. He watched the clip carefully once, then again, paying close attention to every detail of the moment. After a few seconds, he set the tablet down and looked out the window at the endless horizon stretching across the early morning sky. The city below was still hours away, but preparations had already begun long before the plane ever left the ground. Back in Birmingham, the conversation around the video continued growing as more people shared the clip with friends and neighbors. Most viewers still believed the situation might simply be a misunderstanding that would eventually be explained, but none of them realized that someone very far away had already seen the same footage and had already decided that the truth behind that moment on the sidewalk was about to be examined much more closely than anyone expected. The morning traffic in Birmingham slowly thickened as commuters filled the streets, unaware that the quiet story unfolding around one elderly woman had already begun reaching far beyond the city limits. In a small diner a few blocks from the bank, two customers sat at the counter watching the same short video that had circulated through phones across the city overnight. One replayed the moment where Evelyn Carter stood calmly beside the police cruiser while the officers examined the envelope of cash. The scene lasted only seconds, yet something about it made people pause. The way Evelyn spoke, steady but uncertain. The way the officer held the envelope as if he had already made a decision. By late morning, the video had been viewed thousands of times across Birmingham, shared in neighborhood forums and local social media pages where residents quietly debated what might have happened after the clip ended. Some people assumed the situation would eventually be explained by the department, while others simply felt that the moment deserved a closer look. Inside the police station, Officer Derek Collins sat at his desk reviewing routine reports from the previous shift. The envelope containing the cash still rested inside the same drawer where he had placed it the night before. To Collins, it was nothing more than a temporary hold connected to a situation he believed would never attract attention. Officer Mark Reynolds leaned back in his chair across the room, scanning through calls scheduled for patrol that afternoon. Around them, the station remained calm and ordinary, officers moving through the halls while dispatch radios quietly echoed from the front desk. No one inside the building seemed concerned about the video that had begun circulating online. At the same time, several miles away, Evelyn Carter walked slowly along the small path in front of her home, watering the flowers that lined the edge of her porch. The morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass from nearby yards, and for a moment the peaceful routine almost made the previous afternoon feel distant. Yet every few minutes Evelyn glanced toward the road, as if expecting something. She knew her son well enough to understand that when Daniel said he would handle something, he meant it. What she did not know was how close he already was. High above the clouds, the aircraft carrying Daniel Carter began its descent toward Alabama. The cabin lights dimmed softly as the plane adjusted its altitude, and the wide landscape of the southern countryside slowly came into view through the windows. Daniel sat quietly with his hands folded while a secure message appeared on the tablet in front of him, confirming that the video from Birmingham had now been viewed far beyond the city. He studied the screen briefly before closing it and looking out across the distant horizon. To anyone watching, he appeared calm, almost detached, but those who worked with him understood that when Daniel Carter chose to travel somewhere personally, it usually meant the situation was far more serious than it first appeared. As the aircraft continued its descent toward the runway, the quiet streets of Birmingham carried on with their ordinary rhythm, unaware that within the next few hours the simple moment captured outside that small bank would begin drawing attention from people who had the authority to ask questions the city had never expected. The aircraft touched down on the runway just after midday, its wheels meeting the ground with a quiet firmness as the long stretch of Alabama landscape shimmered under the bright southern sun. Inside the cabin, Daniel Carter remained seated for a moment after the plane slowed to a stop, his expression calm and focused as if he were simply arriving for another routine trip. But the people who had accompanied him understood that his presence in Birmingham was anything but routine. When the door opened and the warm air rushed into the cabin, Daniel stepped down onto the tarmac, carrying the same small bag he had brought with him, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to hurry. A dark vehicle waited a short distance away beside the private terminal. One of the men who had traveled with him approached, holding a tablet displaying several updates that had appeared online throughout the morning. The video recorded outside the bank had continued spreading across the city and had now reached thousands of viewers. Daniel looked at the screen only briefly before handing it back. He did not seem surprised. Moments later, the vehicle pulled away from the airport and merged onto the highway leading toward Birmingham. Inside the car, the ride remained quiet while Daniel watched the passing countryside through the window, the wide fields and distant trees sliding by under the midday sun. Back in the city, the police station continued its steady rhythm as officers moved through their assignments for the day. Officer Derek Collins stood near the front desk speaking casually with another patrol officer about the upcoming shift schedule, while Mark Reynolds reviewed the patrol routes posted on the board nearby. The envelope containing the cash still rested inside the same desk drawer where it had been placed the night before. For Collins, the situation remained simple and forgettable, a brief encounter that had already faded from his attention. What he did not realize was that the video from the sidewalk had already reached people whose responsibility was to examine situations exactly like that. Across town, Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her living room, the afternoon light spilling gently through the curtains while she folded a stack of laundry beside the couch. The house felt calm, yet every sound from the street made her glance toward the window for a moment. She had not heard from Daniel again since the short call the night before, but she trusted him enough to know that silence did not mean inaction. Meanwhile, the dark vehicle carrying Daniel Carter passed the welcome sign at the edge of Birmingham and continued toward the center of the city. Traffic moved steadily around them, while office buildings and restaurants appeared along the busy streets. After several minutes, the car slowed near a downtown intersection where Daniel finally spoke for the first time since leaving the airport. His voice remained steady and controlled as he asked a single question about the officers involved in the incident outside the bank. The person in the front seat nodded and handed him another tablet, displaying information that had already been gathered. Daniel studied the names on the screen for a few seconds before looking back out the window toward the city skyline rising in the distance. Somewhere inside that city, 2 officers were continuing their ordinary day, completely unaware that the quiet man now arriving in Birmingham had already begun looking much more closely at what had happened on that sidewalk the afternoon before. The dark vehicle carrying Daniel Carter moved steadily through the busy afternoon streets of Birmingham, while the city around him continued its normal rhythm, traffic lights changing, pedestrians crossing sidewalks, and storefronts filling with people who had no idea that a quiet investigation had already begun. Daniel sat in the back seat, studying the information displayed on the tablet resting in his hands. The screen showed the same short video that had been circulating throughout the city, the moment outside the bank replaying again with careful clarity. The elderly woman standing beside the cruiser. The officer examining the envelope. The uneasy pause that followed. Daniel watched the clip several times without speaking. Every detail mattered to him, from the angle of the camera to the tone of the voices in the background. Finally, he closed the tablet and handed it forward. His expression remained calm, but the focus in his eyes had sharpened. The driver turned the vehicle toward downtown, where the Birmingham Police Department headquarters stood across from a wide public plaza. Inside the station, Officer Derek Collins leaned against the front counter, finishing a conversation with another officer about the previous night's calls. The station remained busy but relaxed, filled with the familiar rhythm of a department moving through another ordinary afternoon shift. Officer Mark Reynolds stepped out of a nearby office carrying a clipboard and glanced toward Collins. Neither of them noticed the television mounted on the wall above the waiting area, where a local news segment briefly displayed the same video clip that had already been spreading across social media. The segment lasted only a few seconds before switching to another story, but the moment did not go entirely unnoticed. A woman sitting in the waiting area looked up from her phone and watched the screen with a puzzled expression as the footage showed Evelyn Carter standing beside the patrol car. Across town, Evelyn herself remained at home, sitting near the front window of her small house. The late afternoon sunlight cast long golden lines across the floor, while the quiet neighborhood carried the distant sound of lawn mowers and passing cars. Evelyn folded her hands gently in her lap and looked at the photograph of her son on the shelf beside the couch. Years had passed since that picture had been taken, yet she still recognized the same calm determination in Daniel's eyes every time she looked at it. She had never asked many questions about the details of his work, but she understood one thing clearly. When Daniel Carter decided to look into something, he did not stop until he understood the truth. Back downtown, the dark vehicle finally slowed as it approached the police station. Daniel stepped out onto the sidewalk and paused for a brief moment while observing the building in front of him. Officers moved in and out through the front entrance, unaware of the quiet man now standing a few yards away. One of Daniel's colleagues approached and quietly informed him that additional footage from nearby security cameras had already been located and was being reviewed. Daniel nodded once, absorbing the information without visible emotion. Somewhere inside the station, the 2 officers who had stopped his mother the afternoon before were continuing their routine day without concern. But as Daniel Carter walked toward the front entrance of the building, the distance between that quiet afternoon outside the bank and the truth behind it was about to grow much smaller than anyone inside the station expected. Daniel Carter stepped through the glass doors of the Birmingham Police Department with the same quiet composure he had carried since the moment he received his mother's call, and inside the building the usual afternoon rhythm continued around him as officers walked between desks, radios murmured with dispatch updates, and paperwork shuffled across counters. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another visitor entering the station, a man in a dark jacket carrying himself with calm patience. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up politely and asked how she could help him. Daniel offered a brief, respectful nod before placing a small identification wallet on the counter. The woman looked down at it, her expression shifting almost instantly as she read the credentials inside. Her posture straightened, and she quietly picked up the phone beside her desk to notify a supervisor that someone had arrived who needed immediate attention. Across the room, Officer Derek Collins leaned casually against a desk while speaking with Mark Reynolds about patrol coverage for the evening shift. Their conversation slowed when they noticed the subtle change in the room's atmosphere. Two senior officers had stepped out of a nearby office and were now walking toward the front desk with serious expressions. Daniel remained still, waiting patiently, while one of the supervisors approached him and greeted him with a tone that carried both respect and caution. The supervisor asked if they could speak privately in the conference room down the hallway. Daniel agreed with a calm nod and followed him through the corridor, while several curious glances followed behind them. Inside the conference room, the door closed softly, and the supervisor asked how the department could assist him. Daniel placed a tablet on the table and tapped the screen once. The video from outside the bank appeared, playing the familiar moment where Evelyn Carter stood beside the patrol vehicle, explaining that the money in the envelope belonged to her. The supervisor watched the clip silently, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. Daniel allowed the video to finish before speaking. His voice was steady and measured as he explained that additional footage from nearby security cameras had already been collected and that the situation required careful review. The supervisor nodded slowly, understanding that the matter had already moved beyond a routine complaint. Meanwhile, outside the conference room, Collins and Reynolds continued their conversation, though both had begun to notice the unusual movement of staff members in the hallway. A few officers walked past the room more than once, speaking quietly among themselves. Something about the change in tone inside the station was becoming impossible to ignore. Back in the conference room, Daniel slid the tablet across the table, revealing another screen displaying still images from surrounding security cameras that showed the same moment from different angles. The supervisor studied the images carefully before leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. After a moment, he asked the question that had quietly formed in his mind since the video began playing. He asked Daniel how he had become personally involved in a situation that appeared to concern a single elderly resident of Birmingham. Daniel remained silent for a brief moment before answering in a calm voice that carried a quiet weight. He explained that the woman shown in the video was Evelyn Carter. Then he paused briefly before adding one more sentence that instantly changed the tone of the room. He said that Evelyn Carter was his mother. The conference room remained silent for several seconds after Daniel Carter spoke those words. The supervisor sitting across from him looked again at the paused video on the tablet, then back at Daniel with a deeper understanding of why this situation had suddenly become so serious. Outside the closed door, the quiet tension in the hallway had already begun to spread through the building. Officers who had passed by earlier were now whispering to one another after hearing that someone from a federal unit had arrived, asking questions about the incident outside the bank. Inside the room, Daniel remained calm, his posture steady and composed while the supervisor slowly leaned forward to examine the additional images displayed on the tablet. The still frames from nearby security cameras showed the moment from multiple angles, confirming the sequence of events on the sidewalk the afternoon before. There was Evelyn Carter standing beside the cruiser with the same quiet dignity she had carried her entire life. There were the two officers examining the envelope she had withdrawn from the bank. And there was the moment when the cash was taken for what had been described as verification. The supervisor inhaled slowly before asking another careful question about how Daniel wished to proceed. Daniel answered with the same calm tone he had used since arriving. He explained that the purpose of his visit was simple. He wanted the full situation reviewed clearly and fairly. No raised voices. No assumptions. Only the truth supported by evidence. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened, and the supervisor stepped into the hallway to request that Officer Derek Collins and Officer Mark Reynolds join them for a brief discussion. Across the station, Collins looked up with mild curiosity while Reynolds shrugged and followed him down the corridor. Neither of them yet understood why they had been called into a meeting with a man they had never seen before. When they entered the conference room, Daniel remained seated at the far end of the table beside the tablet displaying the paused video. Collins glanced briefly at the screen before looking back at the supervisor. The supervisor asked them to sit down and review the footage from the previous afternoon. As the video began playing again, the small room filled with the quiet sounds of the sidewalk scene outside the bank. Evelyn Carter's calm voice. The conversation with the officers. The moment the envelope was examined. When the clip ended, the supervisor placed his hands on the table and asked the two officers to explain the situation in their own words. Collins began describing the stop as a routine check, but before he could continue, Daniel spoke for the first time since they entered the room. His voice remained steady and respectful, yet it carried a quiet authority that immediately drew the attention of everyone present. He explained that additional camera footage had already been secured and that the situation would now be reviewed carefully through the proper channels. The room grew still as the weight of his words settled over the table. Collins and Reynolds exchanged a brief glance, suddenly aware that what they had assumed was a small and forgettable encounter had become something far more serious. Daniel then closed the tablet slowly and looked toward the two officers with calm clarity. He did not raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he simply spoke one final sentence that carried more meaning than anything else said in the room that afternoon. He said that the woman in the video was not just another resident of Birmingham. She was his mother. And in that quiet moment, everyone in the room began to understand that the story, which started on a quiet sidewalk outside a neighborhood bank, was only just beginning to reveal its full truth.